Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your favorite conservatarian, me, Jeff Charles. And it's been a while since I've done an interview because I've been busy and the holidays and all the other excuses I can come up with. But we're back and I've got another amazing conversation for you guys today. And it's going to be a very interesting conversation, especially considering what's going on in the public square right now, especially as it concerns education. And especially for me, since I'm in Texas and we're pushing for school choice in our next legislative session. But before we get into everything, be sure to like this video, share this, and also subscribe. Hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload a new interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard. Also, check out my brand new satire site on Substack at smatteringnews.substack.com. If you like my breaking news tweets on Twitter, you'll like the smattering. So definitely subscribe. You can do a paid subscription. You can do a free subscription, but go ahead and support me. I appreciate all of it. Now, without further ado, I'm going to bring on my guest, Mr. Ian Rowe. He is the founder and CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and the author of a book called Agency, which is very interesting. And he has a lot of other titles too, because he's Jamaican, but we're not going to go into all of that. That'll be my In Living Color reference right there. But
there you go. Exactly. What? You only have 7 jobs? You must have 10 jobs if you're, yes.
Oh, you are so lazy, man.
Oh, man.
Yeah, you are a very busy guy. And so just to give the audience some background, you and I met like last month sometime, I think. You were down here. You were on a panel with Dr. Carol Swain, yes, at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And you were talking about your book, which is very interesting, your approach. And I thought that a lot of what you were saying about education and your background was not only very interesting, but also very relevant to today's conversation about education, school choice, and a lot of the issues that we're seeing in our schools. So, but before we get into all that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into this field?
Well, perfect. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me on. About me. Well, like most of us, we are very shaped by our parents and our family. And my parents, who are from Jamaica, West Indies, came to the United States in the late 1960s, during a little bit of tumult, particularly around race relations.
There wasn't anything going on around that time, though. I don't know what
Exactly. But it's interesting. My parents, like most immigrants to this country, were coming to us. They weren't running from something. They were coming to the United States, even knowing the racial strife that was happening in our country. Because, they knew that the country was changing. The Civil Rights Act had just passed, Voting Rights Act. I mean, clearly the country was really going through a reckoning around race, but they saw opportunity, and they saw opportunity for them and their 2 sons. And they came to New York City, first moved to Brooklyn, then moved on up to Queens, another reference to the Jeffersons. But it was a middle-class life. Moved to a lovely little town in Laurelton, Queens, and I'll share the story in terms of why I am where I am today. I mean, a lot of it is from my parents, but also this experience, which I'm about to describe. When we first moved to Queens, we were in this town called Laurelton, Queens. It's a predominantly white, Jewish, Italian, sleepy little community. But as it became more racially integrated, there unfortunately were just more and more incidents, negative incidents around race. And my junior high school was kind of the epicenter of a lot of these incidents, to the point where the local school board decided that in order to sort of minimize the level of racial strife, they would open and annex another junior high school but in Rosedale, which was a town a few towns over in a predominantly and more permanently white part of town. And what essentially happened, my junior high school, all the white parents took their kids out of our school to send them to this other junior high school, leaving our junior high school, 231, essentially a segregated all black school. And my parents, you know, who come to the United States in search of the American dream under the premise that where the white kids go, that's where the better education will be.
Right.
They were going to take me out of junior high school 231 and send me to this annex. And, you know, in life, there are always these sort of turning points or events that occur that you remember vividly of your childhood. Well, this is one of them, because the Sunday night before the Monday that we were supposed to submit our transfer papers, I did something that was crazy. I begged my parents, like, please don't do this. You know, my parents would, you know, as I've said before, they would crawl through broken glass for me and my brother, right?
Right.
And so who am I to question their decision, right, about going to this other school? But something just didn't feel right. So I begged and I cried and I pleaded. For the first time, I really stood up to my parents and said, no, I don't want to do this. And they relented. They said, okay. And
why didn't you want to go to the other school? Why was
well, just interesting. Well, it was just it wasn't so much why didn't I want to go, why did I not want to go to the other school? It was more, why should I have to leave the school that I'm in? Because it's like, wait, just because everyone that's left is black, why does that have to be bad? Like what just because the white kids have left, why is it magically better over there? And I love my teachers, I love my classmates. And, you know, some of my classmates who were white had left. Was like, that's on them. I mean, they left a good place. And so I just really felt like I wanted to stay. And you know, it's very, very interesting. I wouldn't have used the word agency then, because I had no idea, right? But I feel that was the first time I had ever really experienced what this word actually means. It's like I had skin in the game. I had begged my parents to do something they did not want to do.
Right.
You know, so I felt like I was now invested in my own education, and it was now my responsibility to play a role in shaping the quality of that education. And I'm convinced that experience then informs everything I do today running schools, because the demographic makeup of a school should have nothing to do with the expectations of excellence for that school, whether it's white kids, black kids, green kids, whatever. It shouldn't matter, you know? And so when you ask me, like, how did I get into all this? In many ways, that experience, you know, I mean, I had my parents were married for 48 years before my dad passed away, and my mom recently passed away, and they helped shape everything. But in addition to that grounding of my own personal experience, where I had to almost in a sense question myself, like, wait, do I really want to go along with this idea that I need to literally uproot myself, go to a different school simply because all the kids there are going to be white? That just didn't feel right. And so that's kind of a formative experience that I had.
So you discuss kind of how this already was you understanding the concept of agency, even if you didn't really, you know what that meant. So how do you define the term agency? Like, what do you mean when you talk about agency as it pertains to education?
Yeah. Well, ultimately, and I'll give a little backstory. So, ultimately, like, I now run schools. Like, I'm on my multiple jobs. Like, running schools is the most important thing, because I want kids to know that they can do hard things, right? And in order for you to really believe that you can do hard things, you have to have a sense of agency, that you have the ability to navigate adversity.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just sort of stick-to-itiveness or grit or just determination. All those things are necessary. They're like a necessary but not sufficient component of agency.
Okay.
Because there's also a moral component. So I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment, right? So if you imagine, like, think of agency as a vector or velocity, where velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction.
Right.
So you might have the ability to do hard things, or you might have the ability to overcome, or you have your own free will, but there are lots of bad people that have free will.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the question is, how do you exercise that free will to do hard things towards the betterment of yourself or for your others or your community? And so that's what I write about in agency. So my definition goes beyond just grit or beyond this sense of just stick it out or pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, or because it's not enough. Young people need supports to show them how they exercise their own free will. And that's what I think my distinction is when I talk about agency, because there's a component of it which is, do you understand right from wrong as you exercise your free will?
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you well, actually, before I even dig into that, can you tell us a little bit about your book and give us kind of an overview of the points that you're making in it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, again, part of the reason, I run schools is that, I want young people to know that despite all the challenges that exist, you can lead the life of your own choosing, right? That you can do hard things, that you can lead a self-determined life, that you have within you the tools of self-betterment, the tools of self-improvement. Like, it's really important for young people of all races to understand that fundamental fact. And yet, what I've observed over the last decade, and certainly accelerated in the last couple of years, are these dominant narratives that are actually telling young people the opposite of this idea that they can control their own destiny. And I put it into categories of these two meta narratives.
Okay.
The first narrative I call blame the system, and the other meta narrative I call blame the victim. In the blame the system narrative, that's a view of America, right? America, that if you're not successful, America itself is inherently oppressive based on your race, your class, your gender, some characteristic. It's like the system is rigged against you. If it's about race, there's a white supremacist lurking on every corner. If it's on economics, it's like capitalism itself is evil. Then that these systems are so discriminatory, so rigged, so powerful that you are powerless in your ability as an individual to overcome them. And as a result, you need massive government intervention. You need somebody else to take their boot, off of your neck before you can be successful, right? And if you just think about it for a moment, if you're 10 years old, they're like, what can I do about all those things, right?
Exactly.
So it inherently saps you of your own sense of self-determination.
Yeah, it's self-defeating.
It's self-defeating. Mm-hmm. But then on the other side, there's this other meta-narrative that I call blame the victim. And in that narrative, if you're not successful, it's not America that's the problem. America is great. America is the land of opportunity. In this blame the victim narrative, you are the problem. You have not taken advantage of all of the opportunities that exist in this great country. You know, you should have pulled yourself up by the bootstraps. You are the architect of your own failure. And of course, the challenge with that narrative is that it ignores the reality for a lot of kids that are born or being raised in a situation where they don't have a strong family structure. They're not part of a stronger faith community. They don't have access to school choice and educational freedom. So it's really hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps when you're in a situation like that. And so in my book, I really try to articulate these two arguments because I see them every day playing out in different fashions. But it wasn't enough just to kind of shout in the rain and say, here's the problem. I had to provide an empowering alternative. And that's why I wrote the book, because agency is my counter response. It's my way to say, wait, hold on. There are actually some elements of truth to both blame the system and blame the victim. Like in Blame the System, for example, where I just opened up our new Vertex Partnership Academies high school, only 7% of kids that started ninth grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college. 7%, meaning that they start high school and drop out, or they do earn their high school diploma, but still can't do math nor reading without remediation if they even were to go to college. Mm-hmm. And yet in this district, there's a cap on charter schools. Like, so if you had a great idea to launch a brand new school, you couldn't do it because of this regulatory constraint. So that's an example of a systemic barrier, right? Because a 7-year-old can't solve that problem. So there's an element of truth to blame the system. And in Blame the Victim, there's an element of truth to the idea that, well, part of you being successful is you taking personal responsibility for your own life. It's not all of it, but again, there's an element. So, but these two blame the victim and blame the system ideologies add up to a singular lie. And unless we present some kind of alternative that young people can embrace, like what can I say yes to, then we'll be sort of in this quagmire, which I feel we've been in now, unfortunately, for decades in certain communities in our country.
What would you say is that singular lie that both of these dichotomies are feeding into?
Well, they're just feeding into a sense of helplessness. You know, some psychologists call this, learned helplessness, where you basically just develop this sense of why even bother? You know, New York, the author of the New York Times 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, which says the country was founded on a lie and there's anti-Black racism in the very DNA of the country, all these things. She wrote an 8,000-word piece for the New York Times called What is Owed? And basically it's this treatise on why Black Americans can't close the racial wealth gap, and therefore the only answer is a $14 trillion reparations program. And in this 8,000-word piece, she says, quote, "It doesn't matter what a Black person does. Doesn't matter if you get married. Doesn't matter if you save. Doesn't matter if you buy a home. Doesn't matter if you get college educated. None of those things can overcome," in what she says is, quote, "400 years of racialized plundering," end quote. And so you just read this, you're like, damn. I mean, okay, you're saying if I do those things, none of that will work?
Yeah, like there's no action you can take.
Right. And it's just this kind of message. Now, meanwhile, Nicole Hannah-Jones in her own life has done all 4 of those things. And good for her, right? Good for her, because she's figured out those pathways that are much more likely to be successful living in our country. My thing is, don't hide the ball. You know, young people, especially in situations where they're hearing a message of everything that you can't do, should hear the strategies and the pathways to power for what they can do within their own lives. And that's my empowering alternative to what I think is a blatant lie that others seem to keep pushing. And we just need to have a counterbalance to those kind of ideologies.
Yeah, it's always amazing to me. One of the most frustrating things about Black progressives in particular, especially the ones who are successful, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, Jamel Hill, even LeBron James. I don't know if he identifies as progressive, but he's definitely more on the
I mean, he puts hunted on his, just like, really? Were you hunted in your jacuzzi after you sent that tweet? I mean, just like.
Exactly. I mean, and to me, it's like they are very adamant about telling Black people what they can't do because of this Leviathan called racism. And they devote almost no time to telling Black people how they overcame it, what happened in their lives. And that they overcame it because you just said she's done all those things and she is successful. And she's not the only one. There are plenty of them. So why aren't they, instead of, you talk about a crabs in a bucket mentality. Like, you having made it and refusing to offer the benefit of your experience, and instead you choose to tell them, nope, you can't do it. Yeah, I did it, but you can't because you're Black. Like, how do you not see the issue there?
Right. I mean, even Oprah Winfrey did this whole thing about, like, if you're white, you always have your whiteness. And it's just like this, wow. Talk about, I mean, now
the average white person would rather have some Oprah-ness.
Right. But here's the thing, because right at this moment, people listening to this conversation might say, "Oh, so here they go off the rails again. They're about to blame Black people for their own problems." And so
trust me, I'm getting to the other side in a second.
Because here's where we have to have empathy and say that we can both acknowledge that there are challenges in life, right? You can acknowledge that racism exists, and yet you can make it clear that there are strategies to not make it so that it is debilitating, so that your entire life is somehow now held back because of these forces. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to fight discrimination based on race. Of course we should.
Yeah.
But for one to take the position in present day America that racial discrimination is the single biggest factor holding Black people back, first of all, the evidence just blows that presupposition away. But the worst thing it does, it infantilizes an entire community of people.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you feel, or it has the potential to make people feel like, well, I'm just now at the mercy of somebody else's decision. Mm-hmm. They've got to stop being mean to me. They've got to stop. They. Well, what about we?
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, the the tools of self-betterment, tools of self improvement, they don't just emerge out of nowhere. That's why I wrote my book. Like, this isn't like, well, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It is my framework: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. Because in my book, I say it's not like agency doesn't just happen. Like, people don't become self-sufficient out of nothing. And so we have to revitalize the core institutions that make someone like a Nicole Hannah-Jones, even whatever she might be publicly preaching, she knew in her life that creating a strong family. I don't know about her faith commitment, so I can't speak about that, but she certainly got a strong education and she's clearly entrepreneurial. So somehow she learned that those factors could make a huge difference in her life. And I just want to impart that same knowledge to the millions and millions of young people that are rising and trying to make their own decisions about their own lives.
Mm-hmm. So, when we talk about blaming the victim, you have the other side that basically says, if you don't succeed in America, then that's 100% on you. The government is absolutely perfect when it comes to this stuff. There is absolutely no racism whatsoever. We bash the government on most things, but you bring up racism or even any type of bigotry or obstacles, now, nope, government is perfect, pristine.
Right.
As the snow. So
exactly. The government can do everything.
Yeah, exactly.
It can solve poverty. It can replace fatherhood. It can do everything.
Yeah, oh yeah, all of it. And so if you don't do it, then that means that, there were no unfair obstacles, there's nothing that we need to deal with. It's all your fault. But what you just articulated, even before we got into this, is yes, there are issues in the system that we need to fix. And people as individuals have the agency to overcome those obstacles. So foster that agency while also addressing the issues in the systems. A 10-year-old could figure this out. There's truth to both. And yet on both sides, you see that they only think one is true. On the left, they think, nope, you can't succeed because racism, that's it. Government has to fix it all. There is no agency that, there is nothing that you can do, like you explained with Nicole Hannah-Jones. Then on the right, you have, no, America's perfect, no unfair obstacles, everything's great. You just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Why is it that people can't see that that both of these things are true, and it's not? Why do we have this binary thinking where it's either one or the other?
I mean, it's a great question, right? I know. I just think there's more money and notoriety in extremism, seriously, than there is in diving into the nuance of messy, complex issues.
It's Grifton season.
I mean, hello. I mean, it's you. I mean, just look at Ibram Kendi. Anti-racism. When I see racial disparities, I see racism. Period.
Yeah.
End of story.
There is no other reason.
Nothing. And the thing is, look at the success he has, and look at how the success of this general ideology has been implanted in our country in such a way that even if you suggest there might be other factors that drive, for example, racial disparities, for example, family structure, right? No. You're ignoring the real issue. It's almost like you're excommunicated from, and this is what cancel culture is all about. So why does it happen? I don't know. We've somehow come to a society where nuance and diversity of opinion and what I call multi-causality is not explored, versus what often seems to happen is what I call monocausality. When we're looking at social pathologies in our country, it's often around race. You'll see a disparity and it's like racism. I mean, there's a piece by Andre Perry that I just wrote about life expectancy in the Black community. And to his credit, he says, like, well, depending on where you are in the country, Black expectancy differs. And what's interesting about what he writes is that in those areas of the country where Black expectancy is a little longer, he says that's because of agency of the Black people who are living there, that somehow they're making better decisions and all this kind of stuff. But in the places where Black life expectancy is lower, he says it's racism. Like, well, it turns out if you look at the data, it seems like those are areas where there's a huge Black homicide rate.
Yeah.
The non-marital birth rate has exploded, lack of fathers, much more imprisonment. I mean, but he doesn't go there. He just talks about racism as being this. And so it's just kind of this, but that kind of simplified narrative is what is being celebrated today. And unless you have the courage, I call my book agency, but in some ways, the most important word in our society today is courage. Courage to address these kind of urban myths, these like, no, it's all about systemic racism. It's just like, but that's not what the data says. And then to have the courage to stand up to the criticism you're going to get by putting forth alternative ideas. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, with your ideas, you can get in trouble on the right and the left, really. I mean, and I know because I've experienced it myself, because that's a lot of what I say. I mean, I point out these issues, but you'll also get people on both sides who appreciate it too, because I think people want more of this nuanced thinking, because that actually leads to solutions. And it is sad that, it's more lucrative to just focus on one side. I mean, and that is the fact of the matter. I made the joke it's grifting season, but that is what it is. I mean, because it's very hard to change someone's mind if they're being paid to think a certain way, right?
Well, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, let's look at let's look at the issue. I mean, a big issue that right now, like affirmative action in higher education and college admissions, right? Race-based affirmative action. It is very likely that the Supreme Court in its current composition will determine that race-based affirmative action or race-based preferences in college admissions is going to be deemed unconstitutional. Now, there are people on the left who are like, no, we're going back to Jim Crow. This is, and that's like, wait, but can we just stop for a moment and look at the evidence?
Yeah.
Like when you look at the actual data of, like, let's take even, for example, Black kids being accepted into Harvard or some of the more elite universities. Who's actually being accepted? It's Black kids in upper class, or they're children of recent immigrants. They're not. It's something like 2/3 of the Black kids getting into Harvard are middle or way upper middle class, or recent immigrants, also upper class. And so a very small percent are actually low income Black kids. And so
I didn't know that.
If you're actually interested in the issue, and if we dive in, don't you think, so you think it's a good thing that like rich Black kids are now taking the place of lower income Black kids? Is that what you want? Like maybe
it feels good.
Maybe, well, it feels good, or at least it's virtue signaling for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
But what if we could actually have an honest conversation and see that the real differentiator is income status, right? What if we had class-based? What if we had economic-based affirmative action, where most people in our country would say, okay, if there are only 500 seats in the incoming class of Harvard, do I want it so that I manufacture a certain number of for certain racial representation, even if I'm letting in extremely wealthy Black kids, or do I want low-income kids of all races to have a preference in order to have that next rung up? And so that's what we lose when we have these goggles on, these sort of monocausal goggles. It hurts our ability to have conversations about what really does drive agency for the next generation. So in my book, I try to lay out a whole set of solutions that hopefully help us just think differently about how we advance the conversation, as opposed to just stuck in these rigid sort of divisions, these binaries that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah. I mean, and it's true, because I mean, this is done ostensibly to close those wealth gaps, close the education gaps. But if you're really focusing on Black kids who are already going to be fine, whether they go to Harvard or they go to Yale or they go to another college, you're not really closing any gaps. It is about that lower income. That would be a better idea, but it's less emotionally appealing. So, but I want to get to your solutions. I mean, because you have that acronym FREE, FREE. Yep. So why don't you kind of give us an overview of those 4 pillars? Because when you laid them out on that panel, I thought it was very intriguing.
Yeah. So and let me just make a point about the gaps, because it's connected to FREE, because it talks about 2 of the elements. So there's a lot of legitimate consternation around the racial wealth gap, right? If you look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, you will see that the average white family, race alone, has about $160,000 more wealth than the average Black family. And for a lot of people, that is just proof of the systemic, both historical and present day systemic barrier around Black people having the ability to earn their wealth, right? And so that's a real number, not disputed. But when you take into account just 2 other factors, in this case, family structure and education level, you find that the average Black, married, college-educated family has about $160,000 more wealth than the average white single-parent family. Completely reversed, right? And so what that means is perhaps there are factors beyond just race that will determine what you as an individual have the capacity to achieve. And so my framework that I put in my book, Agency, I like, to know what the tools are, what are the institutions are that can help me exercise agency. And as you said, free: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. Those are the four pillars that if I think more young people were to embrace, we would herald in a whole new age of self-sufficiency and self-determination, and have a rising generation that doesn't look at themselves as victims, but as victors, people who have the ability to be the architects of their own destiny. F is for family, and this is important. It's not about the family that you're from. It's about the family you form. Right? So for example, I talk a lot about this series of data called the success sequence, where data says if a young person finishes their high school degree, then gets a full-time job of any kind, just so they learn the dignity and discipline of work, and if they have kids, marriage first, 97% of the people who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. Why aren't we teaching that in schools? Not as a prescription saying you must do this, but as a description saying you're going to be facing a whole series of decisions in your life. This set of pathways leads to this likelihood of poverty. This set of decisions leads to this likelihood of poverty. You choose, but we teach it. And so, like, for example, in the Black community, I think for as long as the data has been collected, poverty rates have been in the single digits for married Black couples. But yet when you hear discussions around poverty, you're like, no, we need welfare, we need more of this, we need reparations. Like, well, okay, but A, those strategies have not seemed to work.
Yep.
But B, here's this whole body of work around this institution, around family formation, that maybe that's what we should be impressing upon young people. So family, it's about the family you form. R for religion. I put in a lot of information in the book about the power of a personal faith commitment. I see young people, unfortunately, experiencing high levels of loneliness, depression, despair throughout our country. But yet, when you look at kids who have a personal faith commitment and looking at the same data, much lower levels of depression, much lower levels of loneliness. And so the role of a personal faith commitment, again, you can't dictate this, but you want to educate young people around the pillars that can drive real strength for them. E for education, that's about school choice, educational freedom, having the ability to go to a great school. And then the final E, entrepreneurship. In some ways, if you've built a strong family, have a strong faith commitment, you've had access to a great educational choice, you typically have developed, that's usually the foundation for building some kind of entrepreneurial mindset, where you are a problem solver in your own life. So it doesn't only mean start your own business. It just means that you encounter challenges, but you have enough of a foundation to overcome them. And that's how I define an entrepreneurial mindset. And so for each of these F, R, E, E, I have both the set of policy suggestions as well as cultural suggestions in the book, because we've reached the point that, frankly, policy is not the answer to every problem. Sometimes sometimes it's just using the bully pulpit to talk about the importance, for example, of marriage, of morals, of building strong families, having children within marriage. It doesn't mean that if you don't do these things, you're an evil person, but we can no longer ignore the data or ignore all the knowledge we've built over eons of wisdom of what human development, what human flourishing really entails.
So, you mentioned earlier, like, these concepts, they're not really dealt with in schools. You just said, in schools, they don't teach you that if you follow these steps as far as building a family, you're most likely not going to end up in poverty. Obviously, they can't teach religion in schools, or at least not in public schools.
Well, you can't teach a religion and say you must be this religion, but you can teach about what the benefits, what the data says, right? What the differences are for people who do practice certain religions or do have a personal faith commitment. that's fair game for me. I mean, we teach a lot. We teach in school about a lot of things that presumably are towards helping kids make better decisions. Well, why not teach them also about having a faith commitment and what that means?
So why do you think that schools aren't teaching these things? Because it almost, especially today, it seems like they're teaching the polar opposite of that, and they're being even more aggressive about it than even in the past. Why do you think that is?
Well, again, I mean, first of all, there's a whole new wave of teachers who I think have a much greater sense of a social justice agenda than the prior generation. And that has now translated, particularly around race and gender issues, into almost like a shadow curriculum, where it's like, wait, can we just be learning about math and reading and science? And
no, that's literally what it is. It is a shadow curriculum. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like all this other stuff that's suddenly seeping its way, how to be an anti-racist, or, your gender identity at 5 years old. And it's like, wait, when did all that happen? And so what I think the last couple of years with COVID have uncovered, though, is that while this has been happening in schools, this sort of shadow curriculum, more and more parents have gotten exposure to it.
Yeah.
And I think you're starting to see pushback now, where parents are saying, look, we live in a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. We believe in pluralism. Everyone should be treated with dignity and respect. We have common humanity. So we can agree on all those things. But we still have male and female. But
men are still men, women are still women.
Yes, there still are some objective truths, and it seems like even the most basic elements of our society are now being thrown into question. And I think this is, like I talked about it before, the word courage. This is when people need to stand up and say, look, I can both respect someone who, for example, as it relates to gender, I can both respect someone who feels genuinely confused or believes that they're not born into the wrong body, while also still hanging firmly on to biological truths around gender. But for some reason, there's this insistence that no, you now have to question everything that you've ever known before about basics, and you have to believe something different. And that's where I think we're cracking as a society, and we just need more, more calm, reasoned, empathetic voices, hopefully like mine, that are trying to say we can both have compassion and still stand up for certain truths that we know. Because again, without some level of certainty, even agency is hard to achieve in a society, because nothing is certain. You can't rely on anything. It's like, no, there's certain anchors: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. Those are pillars. We want our young people to know that there are institutions that can help them. And so that is what I'm trying to really emphasize, particularly for young people.
Yeah, I mean, especially with these conversations, I mean, we do need, more adults in the room, so to speak, to really discuss the nuance and really dig deep to try to actually solve these problems. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on. How do we push back on the need for people to have certain narratives? Like we discussed that earlier. I mean, on the left, they have one narrative, on the right, they have one narrative, and they both only have half of this issue right. How do more voices like ours, especially like yours, how do we compete with that? Because they're the ones that tend to get the microphone.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, and, first of all, you've got to be willing to take the blows because they're going to come your way. But, what I find is leading with empathy is usually a good place to start. So for example, again, let's take the gender issue or the race issue, almost any of these, just that you actually care about kids. Establish that the thing you care about most is, are our kids in a situation where they can really fulfill their life's potential? You're not some ideologue that's out to, demonize kids or put kids into boxes. you actually care about kids. Like, I actually care about kids. That's why I run schools. That's why, much of my career has been around this idea of cultivating agency within the rising generation. So I think the first thing is just to establish that, so no one can question your motives afterwards. But then, and then it's like, okay, if we have that goal, let's talk about strategies to get there. As it relates to the gender issue, for example, you see a lot of stories now about kids who were transitioned early, who took hormonal drugs and other interventions, and suddenly, they're doing irreversible treatments that all spawned off of what 30, 40 years ago would have been someone called a tomboy, or someone who may turn out to be gay. And yet we're accelerating, we're almost over sexualizing. And so for me, it's just like, look, can we talk about what the real impact of what you think your ideology, your quote unquote gender affirming ideology is? And let's just have a reasoned conversation based on science, right? Like, right now, the administration is considering overhauling Title IX, which was created to exist to protect women's sports. And now they're considering expanding the definition of biological gender to include gender identity, which would support the idea that biological males can now, in school, play in all women's sports. Is that what Title IX was created to do? Let's have a conversation about these things in such a way, because doesn't that likely mean that we're now hurting a lot of young women who want to play sports on an even playing field? And so I don't know. I just try to reason, debate, civil discourse. That's got to be the way we fight ourselves out of this morass that we're in. There are always going to be people who are looking to just have these vibrant lines of division, but we just got to cut through it. And the more that I do that, frankly, the more that I try to show empathy for the people we care about, to talk through what could be empowering strategies, I generally hear, thank you for saying that. I just didn't have the courage to say it out loud.
Well, yeah, I think we've gone full circle. You went right back to courage. I think that's what it's going to take. I mean, people have to be willing to make their opinions known, and to be willing to ruffle some feathers. I mean, because whenever you're pushing for change, you're going to ruffle feathers. So I think that's really the theme of this conversation, which I really appreciate you bringing up. But before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Well, you can find me. I lead Vertex Partnership Academies in New York. That's vertexacademies.org. Or you can find a lot of my work at the American Enterprise Institute website, which is aei.org. And if you're so inspired to explore my book, Agency, it's in Amazon and Barnes and Noble, all the good places. It's well reviewed, and I'm just trying to make a difference, just like all of us, just trying to, especially for young people who are trying to find their way. And more adults, we need, especially those of us who've been successful, we need to preach what we have practiced in our own lives. And I think if we're honest about that, that's the best thing we could do for the rising generation.
Awesome. And I'll make sure I put all the links to all of your stuff in the show notes too. But thanks for joining the program. Hopefully we can do this again, especially as, this next year comes up and the debate over school choice is going to blow up. Hopefully we can do this again.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to come back, and we can even talk about the forums that we're holding across the country, these free forums, family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. We just started in Birmingham. We're about to go to Chicago. A few more cities next year. But how do you bring to local communities these ideas on how to strengthen families, strengthen more young people to pursue a faith commitment, strengthen more educational choice, stimulate entrepreneurship? That's what we're doing across the country. So we should talk about that next time.
Yes, definitely. Well, until then, thanks again for joining, and I'll talk to you later.
Jeff, thank you.